breaking news out of Washington and Beijing, and what we're seeing right now could reshape the global economy for decades to come. Just hours ago, new developments emerged that China is pushing back hard against key provisions of the November trade deal, while the Trump administration announced it's delaying semiconductor tariffs until mid-2027 in what analysts are calling a strategic retreat. In the next 14 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how we got to this precarious moment, who's winning this high-stakes game of economic chicken, and why experts warn the fragile truce signed just 6 weeks ago may already be collapsing. The question everyone in Washington and Wall Street is asking, is this tactical diplomacy, or are we witnessing the beginning of a full-blown economic Cold War? Here's what just happened and why it matters. On December 23, 2025, literally this morning, Reuters broke the story that the United States is postponing planned tariffs on Chinese semiconductor imports until mid-2027. Now, the official line from the Trump administration is that this delay is part of ongoing negotiations with Beijing. But here's what they're not telling you. This represents a significant climb down from the aggressive stance the White House took just 2 months ago. Let me give you the context. Back in November 2025, President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping met in South Korea and hammered out what the White House called a historic trade deal. The numbers were staggering. China committed to purchasing 12 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans in November and December alone, with annual purchases of at least 25 million metric tons through 2028. The U.S., in return, agreed to reduce the so-called fentanyl tariffs from 20% down to 10%, effective November 10th. The baseline reciprocal tariff of 10% would remain suspended until November 2026. And it gets worse. According to data from the Rhodium Group think tank published just 48 hours ago, China's actual GDP growth in 2025 came in between 2.5% and 3%. Roughly half the pace Beijing's official data claimed, and well below the government's 5% target. The U.S. tariffs are taking a real toll. Goldman Sachs research estimates that the cumulative increase in effective U.S. tariff rates on Chinese goods will reduce China's real GDP by 2.6 percentage points, with 2.2 points of that impact hitting in 2025 alone. But here's the kicker. Despite that economic pain, China isn't backing down. In fact, Beijing is doubling down. The Chinese government controls approximately 70% of the global supply of rare earth elements, critical minerals essential for everything from F-35 fighter jets to smartphones to electric vehicles. In October 2025, China announced sweeping new export controls on these materials. The November deal was supposed to eliminate those restrictions. But as we're seeing this week, implementation has been anything but smooth. Now let's break down exactly what's happening beneath the surface, because this isn't just about soybeans and semiconductors. This is about fundamental economic leverage and who blinks first. Think of it like this. When you impose tariffs, you're essentially taxing imports to make foreign goods more expensive and domestic alternatives more competitive. Sounds simple, right? But here's what actually happens. When Trump slapped those initial 10% reciprocal tariffs on Chinese goods, then added another 20% in fentanyl tariffs, bringing the total to 30% on most Chinese imports, American consumers and businesses started paying significantly more. According to the Tax Foundation, the Trump tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,200 per U.S. household in 2025. That's not a one-time payment. That's an annual increase in the cost of goods. China retaliated hard. Between March and October 2025, Beijing imposed escalating counter tariffs reaching 125% on U.S. goods, targeting American agriculture, energy exports, and manufacturing. Soybean farmers in Iowa, pork producers in North Carolina, and dairy operations in Wisconsin got crushed. China also launched what experts call non-tariff countermeasures, antitrust investigations targeting U.S. semiconductor companies, restrictions on technology transfers, and sanctions on shipping entities. The numbers tell a stark story. Research from Oxford Economics shows that the effective tariff rate on Chinese goods entering the US peaked at 37.1% in October 2025. After the November deal, that dropped to 29.3%, still nearly triple the pre-2025 levels. Meanwhile, China's exports to the United States fell by an estimated 18% year over year in the first 3 quarters of 2025, but Beijing redirected much of that production to Southeast Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Peterson Institute for International Economics analyzed the broader economic impact and found that US GDP growth would slow by 0.23 percentage points due to tariffs as of September 2025, while inflation would rise. But China's economy, while larger in absolute terms, showed even more vulnerability, slowing by an estimated 0.2% in real terms by October 2025, according to Yale's Budget Lab. Now compare this to historical precedent. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, passed during the Great Depression, raised U.S. tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. Within 2 years, global trade had collapsed by 66%, and most economists agree it deepened and prolonged the depression. We're not there yet, not even close. But the pattern of tit-for-tat retaliation, the breakdown of multilateral trade rules, and the weaponization of supply chains all echo that dangerous period. The critical mechanism at work here is what economists call supply chain fragmentation. For the past 3 decades, American companies built intricate production networks spanning multiple countries, with China often serving as the final assembly point. When you slap 30% tariffs on Chinese imports, companies can't just flip a switch and move production to Vietnam or Mexico. It takes years and costs billions. In the meantime, they either absorb the costs, crushing profit margins, or pass them on to consumers in the form of higher prices. That's inflation by another name. So who's actually feeling the pain from this trade war? Let's break it down by category, because the impact varies dramatically depending on where you sit in the economy. First, American workers and families. Consider the Johnson family in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Mike Johnson works at an auto parts supplier that sources components from China. When the tariffs hit, his company faced a choice: eat the additional costs or raise prices. They tried to do both. Mike's hours got cut from 40 to 32 per week. That's a 20% pay reduction. Meanwhile, the family's monthly budget for consumer goods increased by an estimated $110, according to data from the Tax Foundation. New electronics, more expensive. Clothing, more expensive. Even kids' toys saw price jumps of 15% to 25% on average. Now multiply that across millions of American households. The Yale Budget Lab estimates that by October 2025, the tariffs had cost the average American family approximately $200 annually in increased prices and reduced real income. That's not abstract economic theory. That's money directly out of people's pockets. Second, small businesses are getting absolutely hammered. Take Sarah Chen, who owns a small electronics retailer in Portland, Oregon. Sarah imports specialized computer components from China to serve local tech startups and repair shops. When the 30% combined tariffs hit, her profit margins evaporated overnight. She tried passing costs to customers, but they started buying from larger competitors with more diversified supply chains. By August 2025, Sarah had laid off 3 of her 7 employees. By November, she was considering closing entirely. According to a survey by the National Federation of Independent Business, 68% of small importers reported severe negative impacts from the 2025 tariffs. Third, large corporations are playing a different game entirely. Companies like Apple, Tesla, and Intel have the resources to navigate this chaos. Apple accelerated its shift of iPhone production to India and Vietnam, a process that began years ago. Tesla negotiated special arrangements for battery components. But here's what's fascinating. Even these giants are feeling the squeeze. Semiconductor manufacturers faced particular uncertainty when China launched antitrust investigations, specifically targeting the chip supply chain. The November deal supposedly ended those investigations, but industry insiders tell a different story. As of mid-December, several U.S. chip companies report continued informal pressure from Chinese regulators. And the stock market? It's been a wild ride. The S&P 500 saw volatility spike by 40% between March and May 2025 during the height of the tariff escalation. After the November deal was announced, markets rallied. The Dow jumped 850 points in a single day. But that optimism has proven fragile. This week's news about delayed semiconductor tariffs and China's pushback on key commitments sent the Nasdaq down 2.3% in morning trading before recovering slightly by close. Fourth, international partners are watching nervously. The European Union, Japan, and South Korea all have massive trade relationships with both the US and China. When Trump signed separate trade framework agreements with Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam during his November Asia trip, Beijing took note. China's Commerce Ministry issued a thinly veiled warning that countries attempting to exploit the US-China trade dispute would face consequences. Translation: if you try to be the middleman, we'll make your life difficult too. Agricultural exporters are living through particularly brutal whiplash. When China imposed 125% retaliatory tariffs on U.S. soybeans in April 2025, prices for American farmers collapsed by 35% within weeks. Soybean farmers in Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana, traditionally Republican strongholds, saw their livelihoods evaporate. The November deal promised relief. China committed to buying 12 million metric tons in November-December 2025 and 25 million metric tons annually through 2028. But as of mid-December, according to USDA export data, China has only purchased about 60% of the promised November-December volume. Farmers are getting anxious. Now here's where this gets really concerning, and why analysts across the political spectrum are sounding alarm bells. Let me walk you through what the experts are actually saying, not the political spin, but the substantive analysis. Trade policy experts at the Peterson Institute for International Economics published a comprehensive assessment last week examining the November deal's stability. Their conclusion, quote, "This agreement represents a tactical pause, not a strategic resolution. The fundamental tensions driving US-China economic decoupling remain unaddressed." What does that mean in practice? It means both sides are using this temporary truce to reposition for the next round of confrontation. Chad Bown, a senior fellow at PIIE, pointed out something crucial: the November deal's one-year time frame. Almost every major provision expires or comes up for renegotiation in November 2026. The suspended reciprocal tariffs, they can snap back instantly. The rare earth export controls, China only committed to a general license valid through October 2026. The whole structure is designed for short-term de-escalation, not long-term stability. Now, as economists and policy analysts have been warning for months, there's a critical legal and constitutional dimension here that's getting overlooked. The Trump administration invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose many of these tariffs, claiming national security threats from China's fentanyl precursor exports. But several federal courts are now reviewing whether IEEPA was properly applied. A lawsuit filed by importers and trade groups argues the administration exceeded its statutory authority. Legal scholars I've spoken with suggest there's a real possibility, maybe 30% to 40%, that courts could strike down portions of the tariff regime in 2026. If that happens, the entire trade framework could collapse overnight. Congressional reactions have been fascinating and deeply divided. Senator Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State in this scenario, praised the November deal as holding China accountable while securing significant agricultural wins. But Senator Elizabeth Warren, speaking to the Senate Banking Committee, called it corporate giveaways disguised as tough negotiation, pointing out that the one-year suspension of semiconductor export controls benefits major chip manufacturers but provides no long-term worker protections or supply chain security. Public sentiment is equally fractured. Polling from the Pew Research Center in November showed 52% of Americans support getting tough on China, But when asked specifically about tariffs that raise consumer prices, support drops to 38%. The message is clear. Americans want results, not pain. But here's what really concerns analysts at institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This isn't just an economic dispute anymore. It's metastasizing into a comprehensive strategic confrontation. China's rare earth export controls, announced in October and supposedly resolved in November, targeted materials essential for U.S. defense systems. The F-35 fighter jet requires specific rare earth magnets. Precision-guided munitions depend on rare earth elements. When China threatened to cut off those supplies, it wasn't just economic warfare. It was a direct challenge to U.S. military capabilities. The Pentagon took this seriously enough that the 2023 and 2024 National Defense Authorization Acts progressively tightened restrictions on rare earth procurement from China. According to a New York Times investigation published just yesterday, the U.S. defense industry has largely succeeded in diversifying rare earth sources over the past 2 years, reducing Chinese dependence from 80% to approximately 40% for defense applications. But commercial industries, they're still overwhelmingly reliant on Chinese supplies. Now let's map out what happens next. In the short term, the next 30 to 90 days, watch 3 key indicators. First, whether China actually follows through on the remaining soybean purchases promised for December. If those shipments don't materialize, it signals Beijing is already backing away from the deal. Second, watch for any new Chinese antitrust investigations or quality control measures targeting U.S. companies. That's how Beijing applies pressure without formally violating the tariff truce. Third, monitor whether the Trump administration moves forward with any new trade actions against countries suspected of serving as transshipment points for Chinese goods trying to evade tariffs. Medium term, looking out 6 to 12 months, the real test comes in mid-2026. That's when nearly all the November deal provisions come up for renewal or renegotiation. And here's the thing, we'll be in the middle of U.S. midterm election campaigns. The political incentives will be to look tough, not conciliatory. Most trade analysts I've consulted expect a renewed escalation starting in the third quarter of 2026, unless there's a major shift in the underlying strategic relationship, which seems unlikely. Let me bring this all together, because what we're witnessing right now is genuinely historic and deeply concerning. Here are the 3 critical points you need to understand. First, the November 2025 US-China trade deal was never meant to be permanent. It's a tactical pause in an ongoing economic conflict, with almost all provisions expiring in late 2026. Second, despite the temporary truce, China is already pushing back on key commitments, while the U.S. is quietly delaying actions it threatened just months ago, suggesting both sides recognize the economic pain is unsustainable. Third, this isn't just about tariffs and trade deficits anymore. It's about fundamental questions of economic security, supply chain resilience, and whether the world's 2 largest economies can coexist without destroying the global trading system in the process. The bottom line, we're in the eye of the hurricane. Things seem relatively calm right now compared to the chaos of March through October 2025, but that calm is deceptive. The fundamental forces driving this conflict, China's technological ambitions, America's economic nationalism, supply chain vulnerabilities, and great power competition, haven't changed. They've just gone quiet for a moment. What do you think happens next? Will this administration actually follow through and impose those semiconductor tariffs in 2027? Or is this just negotiating theater? Will China keep its promises on agricultural purchases and rare earth exports? Or are we headed for another round of escalation by this time next year? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you're seeing and experiencing in your industries and communities. If you want to stay informed on stories like this that directly impact your economic security but don't always get the full analysis they deserve from mainstream outlets, make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next breakdown. This trade war is far from over, and what happens in the next 12 months could reshape American jobs, prices, and prosperity for decades to come. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.